Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Podbean, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So I've been researching over the past month or so about the history of the papacy, which naturally has been on people's minds and in the news because of the recent really momentous development of the first ever American pope being elected to the papal throne. And I figured I should talk about the papacy specifically, also because it's this continuing through line, this long-lasting institution that keeps showing up over and over again in all kinds of other histories of politics and religion and art. And you may know, if you listened to my last lecture on Patreon for patrons about Italy from the unification up until the First World War, the papacy and the characters and agendas of the different popes played, of course, into that history. So it's something that you keep encountering from different angles, but people rarely actually sit down and grapple with it in and of itself. And as I think you'll see, it's one of the most dramatic historical stories that one can possibly tell in all of known history. It's the story of the emergence of an institution that over centuries became powerful and prominent in the world, but it is not at all a linear history. There have been the most extraordinary ups and downs, where popes at certain moments in history have reached heights of splendor, authority, prestige, as not only the preeminent spiritual leaders in Western civilization, but also as monarchs commanding their own lands and armies, and at other moments have been really humiliated as simply pawns, even prisoners of foreign powers, and as laughingstocks of the Western world. So it's one of the most richly dramatic stories that you could possibly tell, and it's very rarely, I think, ever looked at as an important history in and of itself. So just to begin with, what are we talking about? What is the papacy? Well, it's an institution like a monarchy, but elective and theocratic. And basically, it is the duties, powers, and prerogatives attaching to the office of the Pope. So what is the Pope? This is a word that originally at root just means father. But the Pope, strictly technically speaking, is simply the Bishop of Rome. That's it. And even non-Catholics in other Christian churches will generally accept that on some level. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome. In other words, the main leader and caretaker of the Christian church in the city of Rome. And like other bishops, he has the roles of managing money, appointing priests and deacons, and communicating and coordinating with other bishops in other dioceses. But of course, obviously, in the world today, the Pope is seen as much more than simply that. And by members of the so-called Roman Catholic Church, he is considered the supreme head of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, meaning the single all-embracing Church of Christ. Catholic meaning universal, all-embracing, and apostolic meaning tracing its origins and succession back to the apostles themselves. So Catholics view the Pope as the infallible arbiter of orthodox Christian doctrine, with powers to appoint and remove all clergy, including other bishops, and the power even to excommunicate, meaning to exclude individuals from the Eucharist or the communion, hence denying them the means of Christian salvation. And the Pope is these things by virtue of being, for one thing, the successor of St. Peter, and hence, in a sense, the vicar of Christ and the closest thing to God's representative on earth. So the papacy has taken on this very strange and dramatic dual role, both local and global, right? The caretaker of the Christian flock within Rome, and also the supreme head of the global Catholic Church, which is today the largest civil or religious organization in the world. And hence the reason why the Pope's inaugural speech, which he usually makes to address people gathered in the piazza in front of St. Peter's when he is first elected, this speech is customarily called Urbi et Orbi, meaning to the city and to the world. So how did this happen? How did this come about that the Bishop of Rome is seen as this supreme religious leader to over 1 billion people and as a public figure, a powerful figure of influence and arguably the greatest sort of moral and public diplomat in the world? How did this come about? Well, it did not start off this way from the beginning. Rather, the early church in the first few centuries was very decentralized. It was run by a network of bishops based in each different city or diocese. Each bishop was quite independent. And also sometimes decision and management was taken up by regional councils called synods, which would include bishops from around a certain region and also often prominent lay people or elders in the church. So the Pope was not necessarily seen as the boss of the Christian church or even of the Western Latin church. Rather, papal authority had to be gradually consolidated through a long process whereby bishops of Rome and the so-called See of Rome, or the kind of headquarters of the church in Rome, asserted their preeminence in the Christian world. And this was disputed at every step. It was never a straightforward, universally accepted arrangement. And what basically happened over time is that churches in the West, where Latin was most commonly used, eventually accepted the primacy of Rome and of the papacy, hence why they came to be known as Roman Catholic, again showing this duality, both local and universal. So in this way, the papacy and the Catholic Church are mutually constitutive. Right? The Pope is the head of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is simply that part of the Christian world that views the Pope as the supreme leader of Christendom. So I'm going to try to tell this story of the papacy, and I expect it'll be in 2 parts. This will just be the first part, probably going up through the ancient and medieval times up to the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Reformation. And then in a second part, I will go up through the modern papacy, including up to the recent contemporary popes, Benedict, Francis, and this new pope of Leo XIV. But this cannot just be a simple chronological recounting. There have been, it seems, 266 popes by the traditional reckoning, from St. Peter up to Robert Prevost, who recently became Leo XIV. So we're talking about an institution with turnover of an average of about every 7 years. A new pope comes to the throne. And when you're talking about 2,000 years of history, that is simply too much variation. Every pope is different and responds differently to the different roles and missions of the papacy and to the different crises that arise in their reigns. And the institution, too, is always evolving along multiple dimensions. And so it's impossible to tell a simple linear chronological story. And rather, I'll look at a lot of this thematically, looking at the different functions that the papacy has played and the different roles it's stepped into at different times. And especially when looking at the early centuries, this is where the papacy gradually emerged into a position of power and authority. And this was very much a non-linear process. Okay, so with all of that being said, where did the papacy first come from? Well, its roots were in the early Christian church in Rome, basically in the 1st century AD. And the church in Rome was a small gathered group of believers, mainly, it seems, Jewish. So at this time, there was a sizable Jewish community in Rome, about 30,000 Jews in the city of Rome. They were mainly Greek-speaking, and they had migrated at some point or other from the eastern parts of the empire, Palestine, Asia Minor, Greece, Syria, and migrated and formed this Jewish group in Rome. And some of these migrants probably were the first vectors to bring Christianity from that early church in the East into Rome. And the first ground in which Christianity took hold was within the Jewish community. And it seems that the small Christian group in Rome early on adopted the common Christian practice of burying their dead in a special cemetery plot. And it seems that theirs was on the Vatican Hill, a hill on the western fringe of the city of Rome, west of the Tiber River. And in these early decades, the church in Rome, it seems, was relatively small, much smaller than in other Greek-speaking cities to the east. And it was on the sort of far western fringe of the Christian world. but apparently it was seen as promising by early apostles of the church. For one thing, due to, as we mentioned, the relatively large size of this Jewish group in Rome, and also to its important location in the imperial capital, where it could serve as a sort of nerve center for communication with the growing Christian world, especially then as Christianity continued to spread into the West. And this is probably the reason why, according to some early Christian documents, the church in Rome was visited by St. Paul, and also, very importantly, by St. Peter, who not only visited, but settled there for several years. And this makes a lot of sense, especially because, according to the biblical texts, Peter and Paul sort of divided the world between them into two mission fields, where Paul would preach the gospel to Gentiles and Peter to Jews. Right? So he would have been attracted to this nascent Christian church among this sizable Jewish group in Rome. And according to later Christian texts, it's hard to say how definitely reliable these are, but according to Christian texts that might date from around 100 or so, these say that Peter actually settled in Rome, served as the first bishop of the church there, and died there, being persecuted and crucified by the Romans. And it happens that in later years, archaeologists in Rome they have excavated in the Vatican Hill and have found the remains of an early Christian cemetery, and set within it the foundations of a small open-air shrine with altars called an edicula, which would have served as a place of Christian prayer and gathering, and which most likely was dedicated to the memory of St. Peter. It was sort of a cenotaph consecrated to Peter. Now, the precise actual facts of Peter's time in Rome are uncertain, but the fact that he served as a bishop there gave the church in Rome a special elevated status, right? Because they had this connection to this supremely important disciple and apostle of the early church. Later, as the Christian group grew, a church building, it seems, was dedicated to Peter on the Vatican Hill, and that hill ever since then has come to be closely associated with the early church, with St. Peter, and with the Papacy, the institution that claims and traces its origins to Peter. Later bishops of Rome who followed after Peter are regarded as specially important among Christians in the Western Empire, and they are sometimes, it seems, called informally by the name Papas, which is a Greek word for father, although they are not the only ones that are called that way. Other important prominent bishops around Europe also, it seems, were sometimes called Papas. Now, in the 2nd century and following after, the papacy took up increasingly important roles in the world of Rome and the Christian world. So probably the first among these was they took up the role of protector of the Christian community against persecution. So the bishop was very likely to be a prominent member of Roman society. They were not just any random member of the flock. And also, after about 100, more Gentiles also began to convert and join the Christian church. And hence, after about 150 or so, the church was making significant inroads into the Roman upper classes and even into the imperial court. And in this situation, the bishops of Rome then could cultivate prominent patrons with connections at the imperial court in order to gather intelligence, provide forewarnings of possible persecution or crackdowns, or even to relieve persecution of the Christian church. For instance, in the late 100s, under the Emperor Commodus, who was known as especially brutal and violent, reportedly Commodus had his large harem managed by a eunuch named Hyacinthus, who was a Christian and a presbyter or elder of the Roman Church. And Hyacinthus was very well liked and respected in the court, including by the emperor's wife Marcia. And reportedly, Hyacinthus and the Pope Victor were able to persuade Marcia to secure pardons for Christians who had been sentenced to labor in the mines in Sardinia. So this sort of role of advocate and protector of the church in Rome, this ended after Constantine, especially after that emperor issued the Edict of Milan in 313, which legalized Christianity and even made it a sort of state-supported religion. So this Edict of Milan allowed the church, you could say, to come out of the closet, and now church buildings were built mainly for the use of Christians in the city. The first Basilica of St. Peter's, a sort of grand Roman-style house of worship, was built basically on the common Roman template on the Vatican Hill. And this Basilica of St. Peter stood for over 1,000 years. It became a major place of pilgrimage and the main seat of the Pope as the leader of the Western Church, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. While at the same time, there was another basilica on the Lateran Hill, closer to the heart of the city of Rome, which was dedicated to St. John, and that was really the main seat of the Pope in his role as Bishop of Rome. Right? So popes were often seen shuttling back and forth between St. Peter's, way off in the Vatican to the west, and St. John in the Lateran, more inside the city. And again, the Pope sort of had to wear these two hats, you could say, as leader of the Universal Catholic Church versus Bishop of the city of Rome. Nonetheless, this transformation, where Christianity was able to come out and become an open and state-supported church, this transformation came right as the Western Roman Empire was in decline, as the heart of the Roman government was removed to the east, to the new city of Constantinople, and as Rome became increasingly vulnerable to instability within the empire and also to migrations and invasions from the north. So now the Pope had to step into another role, which was not simply defender of the church, but defender of the city of Rome. So there was something of a power vacuum, especially after the Western Empire itself moved its regional capital to Ravenna, up on the Adriatic in the year 402. So the city of Rome now increasingly turned to the popes to help lead defense of the city against the new invaders, like Goths, Huns, and then also centuries later, Lombards and Arabs. So firstly, in 408, Goths, under their commander Alaric, invaded Italy, and they wanted to overthrow the Western Roman Emperor Honorius, and Honorius then fled into the swamps to escape the Goths. So this very much left the Pope, named Innocent, in Rome to somehow manage the defense of the city and to negotiate with the Goths. And through these negotiations, the city agreed to pay a huge ransom, and it was still raided by the Goths nonetheless, but there was no mass killing. It was not an all-out sack of the city. And moreover, the churches were left alone, partly because Alaric himself was a Christian, and he held back from doing that. After this raid of Rome, Alaric then continued with his warriors southward through Italy, and very soon after he died of a fever, aged only 40. Then, more than 40 years later, in 452, Attila the Hun crossed the Alps and invaded northern Italy. The Huns sacked the cities of Aquileia and Milan and clearly took aim at Rome. But the Pope at this point, who was Leo I, rode out from Rome northward and intercepted Attila near a lake in northern Italy. And they meet in person. And we don't know exactly what happened, but it seems that Leo said or did something to persuade Attila to turn back, and the Huns simply left and moved on through Europe and never attacked Rome. And we don't know precisely what was said in this conversation, but it was observed and considered at the time that the Huns were superstitious. They were very attentive to the powers of gods and spirits in the fates of mankind. And so it is conceivable that maybe Leo mentioned to Attila the fact that Alaric, shortly after he had raided Rome, died of a fever, and perhaps he suggested to the Huns that Rome was somehow specially spiritually protected, and that if they attacked Rome, they would meet a similar fate. But whatever was said here, this incident where Leo successfully turned the Huns away helped to establish the papacy as the main civil authority ensuring the defense of the city. And after this point, the popes were basically left in charge of governance and defense of Rome under the sort of broad suzerainty of the Gothic kings in the early 500s, and then after 550 under the Byzantines, who invaded Italy and took Rome and most of central Italy from the Goths. Now, as the papacy gained in power and prestige through these years, they also then took up an important third role, which was defining orthodox doctrine. So the popes engaged in disputes and debates over core Christian teachings, most especially the Trinity and the nature of Christ, right? This question of whether Christ was human or divine or both. But in general, it was difficult for the popes to wield authority in the Christian world in this realm, as for one thing, Rome was declining, and as Roman priests were not nearly as learned as their counterparts in the East. So by this time, after about 300 or so, the Roman Church had begun operating in Latin, which was the common spoken language in Rome and in Italy, and they were no longer mainly speaking Greek, right? That era was now past. And so that meant that the Romans basically were not part of these debates over metaphysics and theology that were being conducted in the Eastern Empire in Greek. And it really took a long campaign for the papacy to achieve a great enough position of prestige and influence to hold sway in these disputes over doctrine and theology. But they were able to draw on certain crucial sources of prestige to sort of bolster and justify their authority. So, as we mentioned before, there were early texts referring to Peter and Paul being in Rome. For example, the epistle 2 Peter, which came to be included in the New Testament of the Bible, which made it possible to trace the church in Rome to these very important preeminent apostles. Also, in the Gospels, Peter appears as especially important among the disciples. He's often seen acting as a leader or a spokesperson of the disciples. And most importantly, they could point to a passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, which recounts a conversation between Christ and Peter, who at this time was still called Simon. That was his real name, right? And this particular passage it gives an explanation of how Simon ended up with this new name. And in this passage, Christ gives him the moniker in Aramaic, Kephas, which means the rock. And in Latin, the rock is Petrus, right? So that's where this name Peter comes from. It's a translation of Kephas, the rock. So in this particular passage in Matthew, Christ is conversing with his disciples, and he asks them, who is the Messiah? Right? He's sort of planting these questions and ideas in his followers' minds. And the passage reads, quote, Simon answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter." Right? In Aramaic, you are Kephas. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So this passage is used by supporters of the papacy to argue that Peter was specially chosen to be the leader of the church after Christ. He is foundational. He is the rock, the cornerstone. And Peter has the so-called keys of heaven, representing some sort of special power over the access to salvation and eternal life. And hence you may notice to this day 2 crossed keys are used as a symbol of the papacy, for instance seen in the seal on the Vatican flag. And also in St. Peter's Basilica, if any of you have been there, you see this passage from Matthew inscribed in enormous letters in Latin in the frieze running around the base of the vault of the basilica. With time, the papacy was able to gain some recognition of their primacy from other church leaders in other dioceses, especially in the West. For instance, the theologian Irenaeus, who lived in the 2nd century, he served for a time in the late 100s as the Bishop of Lyon in Gaul, in what's now France. And he also was very concerned with correct doctrine, and he was known most of all for his writings opposing and refuting Gnosticism. And in this same book, he argued that Christians ought to look to the church in Rome as the most authoritative with regard to doctrine, since it can be most definitely traced back to Christ and his disciples. And in this passage, he calls the church in Rome, quote, "the greatest and most ancient church known to all, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, that church which has the tradition and the faith which comes down to us after having been announced to men by the apostles. With that church, because of its superior origin, all the churches must agree. That is all the faithful in the whole world, and it is in her that the faithful everywhere have maintained the apostolic tradition." Now, it's important to note in this passage, for one thing, Irenaeus' claim is not based on Rome's political importance as a political capital, but rather on its putative link to the apostles Peter and Paul. And in later years, as Rome went into political decline and was overtaken by the new eastern capital at Constantinople, the popes would emphasize, again, that their authority was based not on Rome's worldly political position, but on their own direct apostolic succession from St. Peter. Now, further, in the mid-200s, the church would come under heavy persecution under the Emperor Decius. Many Christians abjured the faith in order to survive the persecution. And then after the persecution ended, and this is what tended to happen, there would be a wave for a year or two, and then it would subside. After this persecution ended, some of those, you could say, apostates who had denied their Christian faith then wanted to come back and return and be accepted in the church. And this led to problems. For instance, some Christians who had held fast through this time of persecution did not want to let the deniers and apostates back in. In their view, they had committed this greatest sin of apostasy. And different churches became split over this question, what to do about the backsliders. And St. Cyprian, who was the bishop of Carthage in North Africa, formulated a kind of middle way, where he argued that apostates who wanted to return to the fold must confess what they have done, show contrition, and then they can again take communion and be part of the church. Well, Cyprian further argued that bishops, when they were in doubt about the proper practice, they should look for a model to Rome, which he called, quote, "the chief church whence priestly unity takes its source." So if you want consistency, you need some sort of central model, benchmark, and he argued that was Rome. And also, you may note here that Cyprian's system basically developed into what we now know as the sacrament of confession and penance. And this, in indirect way, this further served to underscore the importance of the Roman Church and the papacy, because, according to the Gospels, St. Peter himself denied Christ. After Christ was condemned and a sort of mob was looking for his followers, Peter reportedly denied his faith in Christ in order to save himself, and he then later repented. And so in this way, Peter could be seen as the model and archetype of all Christian believers who sin, but then are able to repent and remain in the church. And up through the years, much of the art glorifying the papacy and the Catholic Church has taken the theme of St. Peter's denial of Christ, or his repentance after denying Christ, which, again, in this sort of ironic way, underscores and underpins the prestige of the papacy. So what role did popes actually play in theological debates? Well, different schools of thought emerged through, especially after 300, that emphasized one side or the other of Christ's nature. So in the early 300s, a theologian in Alexandria named Arius put forward the doctrine that Christ was not eternal like God the Father, but instead was created by the Father, and so was more like a human, right? Humankind was created by God, and Christ is less divine. He sort of ranks below God the Father. And this idea became very popular, including among newly converted tribes in Western Europe that were coming into the Roman Empire and adopting Christianity. Now, shortly after this, an opposite doctrine emerged in the Eastern Empire, especially around Constantinople. This one held that Christ had only one nature, which was divine, and if he had any human element at all, it was minor and inconsequential, and one theologian said that it was subsumed into Christ's greater divine nature like a cup of water thrown into the ocean. So this opposite school of thought was called monophysitism, meaning only one nature, and it was divine. So popes in Rome disputed both of these ideas, both the Arian idea that made Christ human and the Monophysite idea that made him divine. And they ultimately rejected both of these views as heretical, and instead they promoted a kind of compromise view that Christ had two natures, one fully human and fully divine, which were joined together in one person. And this doctrine was called the hypostatic union, the union of two essences. So all these different ideas and arguments are all floating around. People are condemning and excommunicating one another with unclear authority. And in 451, the Eastern Emperor Marcian called an ecumenical council. So a gathering, in principle, a gathering of all bishops from all around the Christian world in order to discuss these theological problems. And Pope Leo I, the same one who we talked about earlier, who met with Attila and turned the Huns back out of Italy, Leo I wrote a long philosophical letter, or so-called tome, arguing for this idea of the hypostatic union, a fully divine and fully human nature. And he sent this letter, although he didn't go to the council at Chalcedon, he sent his letter and it actually carried the day, which was quite impressive for this, Western Latin bishop. Now, the idea of Christ having one divine nature, this monophysitism, did not entirely disappear in the East. It lingered on. But nonetheless, the fact that Leo could win this very high-level theological debate on the one hand, while at the same time fending off Attila the Hun with the other hand, was undeniably impressive. And hence, this Leo I was the first pope to formally be called the Great. Right? He's also called Leo the Great. Now, still the big challenge to papal primacy was, of course, the East, right? And this began right away with the establishment of Constantinople, which grew and became the main political and military center of the empire, and which was established, unlike Rome, was established from the beginning as an expressly Christian city. So the rise of Constantinople created a great new challenge and raised the question of whether Rome should be seen as the principal center or even one of the principal centers of the church. And a general idea, a sort of compromise idea, developed through the 300s and 400s, which held that there were 5 major Christian cities, or sees, that all held special authority. And these were Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And Alexandria at this time was a major city, a center of learning. It had been the great center of the Hellenistic world. It was the site of the great library. And then Jerusalem and Antioch were comparatively smaller, Jerusalem especially, but they were religiously important, right? Jerusalem was a holy city, the place of Christ's crucifixion. Antioch was an early city of the church. It was the seat of St. Peter before he went to Rome. But nonetheless, Rome and Constantinople were by far more politically important. And over the years, they began to really emerge from among this group as the most assertive, and they gradually become competitive over who was really top dog in the church. And this rivalry between Rome and Constantinople is really the longest running political tension and division in the entire history of the church. And the Eastern Church had certain advantages. The 4 ecumenical councils, these 4 councils held through the 300s and 400s to debate important theological issues, they were all held in the East, either in or near Constantinople. And the popes had fairly little presence or influence, especially early on, because of the great distance, the language divide, and many popes were reluctant to take part at all or to even recognize these ecumenical councils in the East. The first council at Nicaea was held during the time of Constantine. Only 5 bishops from the West attended, while hundreds from the East were there. The Pope himself didn't go. He just sent 2 priests as sort of observers. The Second Council in 381 was held in Constantinople. No Western Latin bishops attended at all. And this one endorsed legal persecution, bans on paganism, heretical groups, and restrictions on Jews. So the church was becoming for the first time a persecuting church, and that authority to define the limits of proper Orthodox teaching was being claimed by this council at Constantinople. And the council declared, quote, "The Bishop of Constantinople shall have the preeminence in honor after the Bishop of Rome, for Constantinople is the new Rome." Now, you may be able to guess, how did the Pope in Rome respond to this. It was not enough for the Pope Damasus in Rome to say, well, okay, at least you're saying I'm first. Rather, he objected and argued, he corrected them, that Rome got its prestige not from the fact that it had been an imperial capital, a status that it was gradually losing, but rather from its apostolic pedigree tracing to Peter and Paul. And by this measure, the Pope argued, Constantinople ranked very low, below even Antioch or Alexandria. So this growing divide between East and West led then to a campaign in the West to assert papal primacy from the late 300s through the 400s. Firstly, this Pope Damasus, who we mentioned, who took issue with the pronouncements of the Council at Constantinople, he was the first to actually use the title Pope for himself. So that had been in a sort of unofficial, informal moniker, really, father, right, papas. He was the first to formally call himself Pope and claim that that title linked him to the apostolic authority from Peter. He was followed then by the Pope Siricius, who commissioned the Vulgate Bible from St. Jerome. That's a full translation of the Bible into Latin, and which first started to declare, in a sense, that Latin would be the language of evangelism, of the spreading of the faith. Then in the early 400s, Pope Innocent asserted that the ultimate authority in the church might be a synod or ecumenical council, but only the Pope had the authority to convoke one. Right? So the Pope gets this sort of, there's this kind of catch that reserves supreme authority in a way to the Pope. And after 440, when Pope Leo the Great took the throne, he was the first then to use the Latin title Pontifex Maximus, which originally, it means at root chief bridge builder. Pontifex is the builder of bridges, but it was the title used by the head priest of the Roman state cults and the Roman Empire. So in a sense, he's now drawing upon this ancient Roman pagan state cult, but Christianizing it. And in a sense, you could say maybe taking up the mantle of the Roman state and adding it to his spiritual authority. So papal prestige and authority, including in matters of doctrine, did, it seems, grow over time, which helps to explain why Pope Leo was able to have the final say in the decision of the Council of Chalcedon in 451. But Constantinople didn't just accept this. They struck back and reasserted their authority, especially after 500, with the success of the Eastern Emperor Justinian in reestablishing Byzantine power. So in the 500s, the Byzantines fought a long war against the Goths, took control of most of Italy, including Rome. And Rome by this time, by the time it was captured, was very much shrunken, really just a shell of its former self. And in 588, the Eastern Patriarch really aggressively asserted himself now as the supreme Christian authority and started using the title of ecumenical patriarch. And ecumenical, again, being another word like Catholic for universal, all-embracing, all-inclusive. So he was in this indirect way sort of shoving aside the popes. And the Pope protested against this to the Byzantine emperor, but the emperor backed up the patriarch. Right? That's where the real power was. So the divide was intensifying, and it probably seemed by the end of the 500s that the Eastern Church, based on sheer political power, might prevail and win back the mantle of leadership in the Christian world. But this did not end up happening. So the next pope who came to the throne just 2 years after this dispute, in the year 590, this pope would change the whole terrain of the struggle between East and West, and that was Pope Gregory. So Gregory had been a Benedictine monk, and he had served as a papal envoy to Constantinople. And from his experience there, he detested the Byzantines. He hated their pomp and extravagance, as he saw it. And he very much wanted to regain the upper hand for the Western Church against the Byzantines. And his strategy was to reorient the Western Church away from these internecine struggles over doctrine, and instead towards missionism and spreading the faith. So Gregory's reign, coming right in the middle of this very difficult period, what you could call really the first dark age of Western civilization, his reign illustrates the common repeating pattern in the papacy, which is a repeating vacillation between two modes. between, on the one hand, defending the faith and retrenching against heterodox doctrines, and on the other hand, putting aside questions of doctrine and instead spreading the faith, bringing new believers in the world at large into the fold. So these two approaches reflect, you could say, two different models of the role of the papacy, as chief defender of the faith and arbiter of true doctrine versus as chief propagator of the faith. And arguably underlying this, two competing models of the church, as a missionary church trying to conquer the world spiritually versus as a sanctuary keeping outside spiritual contamination and heresy at bay. So Gregory arguably became the first great missionary leader of the Western Church. And as we said, he came to the papal throne in 590. He was not a theologian or a philosopher. He was a monk who lived a simple lifestyle in the Benedictine style, and reportedly, even when he was pope, he ate every day with 12 paupers at his table. He did write a book, but it was on pastoral work and care, not on theology or metaphysics. He had, it seems, a relatively simple faith, much inflected with folk beliefs. He was a believer in prophecies and veneration of the saints, which was becoming more and more popular among the Christian folk. As pontiff, he mainly threw himself into spreading the gospel, and in order to do so, he enacted a reform program, reorganizing and centralizing the church in order to make it more efficient and profitable, much like a monastery. A lot of Benedictine monasteries were engaged in industries like brewing or furniture making in order to make money and be self-supporting. And in Pope Gregory's instance, the goal was to fund missionary work. So the church by this time did have extensive properties in land that had been accumulated through the years from donations and bequests, and these lands collectively came to be called the patrimony of St. Peter. But they were spread all over Western Christendom and were very difficult to manage or to draw revenue from. And the church in Rome had traditionally been run by a committee of 19 deacons, from which the pope usually was chosen. Each pope usually was one of these deacons when he was elected. But beyond Rome, the bishops of the different cities were generally very independent, and there was hardly any central treasury. So Gregory created a chancery, a sort of ecclesiastical civil service run by deacons and prefects, which would centralize oversight of the whole Western Church and particularly manage the lands and collect monies from them into a treasury. So the effect of this was a stronger, more centralized church, which was in almost total control of central Italy around Rome. This became, in effect, a sort of unofficial papal domain, and also had significant wealth and power beyond, even outside Italy. And money from all these lands were funneled into the project of Christianizing and Catholicizing Europe. So Gregory focused on spreading the faith to the north and the west, and Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire was largely pagan, or even much of the Christians in the Western Empire were Arian, right? They subscribed to that belief system that had been condemned as heretical. And Gregory used different strategies to spread the faith and to spread what he considered the Orthodox Catholic faith. One was art forms like building and also church ceremony, especially music. Plainsong church chant has come to be called Gregorian chant. And Gregory used a sort of diplomatic missionism, including by giving of gifts and sacred relics. For instance, he reportedly gave a key fashioned out of the chains that had held St. Peter when he was imprisoned in Rome, and gave this key to the Spanish king who rejected Arianism and aligned the church in Spain with Catholic orthodoxy. But thirdly, and most importantly, to convert pagan lands, he sent missions out into the field, and it seems he was especially interested in Britain, which he saw as an important and promising missionary field. There's a traditional story that was told through the years, holding that before he became pope, when Gregory was a Benedictine monk, he traveled through northern Europe, and in a slave market he saw captive children being brought to the slave mart, and he asked, "Who are they?" And he was told they are Angli, meaning angels. And he said, "I do not see Angli, but angeli, I see angels," right? Indicating that he saw the promise of Christianizing Britain through Anglo-Saxon migrants. Now, we do know that in 597, he sent out a team of 40 monks under a missionary named Augustine to Britain. They landed at Kent in the southeastern corner of Britain, and they were allowed to set up a monastery there at the town of Canterbury, which became, it seems, the first Benedictine monastery in the world outside of Italy. And after that point, Canterbury became the main base of the spread of Christianity into England. And even to this day, it is the main ecclesiastical seat of the Church of England. So all in all, Gregory's reign extended the church to the north and the west, and also further into everyday life and into society on the ground. And it established the idea that the church was the one universal institution of the West that pervaded all of life and society, and that the papacy was its nerve center. But nonetheless, Gregory could not escape politics, and Rome was increasingly vulnerable and unstable. Gregory died in 604 after only 14 years on the throne, and afterwards Rome and the papacy were often then treated as pawns of Byzantium. In 653, a theological debate broke out over the question of whether Christ had one will. So this was another, arcane theological debate. But this time, the Eastern Emperor issued an edict trying to mediate this debate, and the Pope rejected this, right? That the Eastern Emperor, who wasn't even a patriarch of the church, had no right to arbitrate in this theological dispute. So Byzantine authorities in Italy arrested this pope, Martin I, took him to Constantinople, where he was publicly flogged and exiled to the Crimea, where he died shortly thereafter. So popes now really are at the mercy of Byzantine power. In 726, the Byzantine authorities issued an order of iconoclasm, right, commanding the destruction of images in churches, since they saw that as idolatry. The Pope in Rome refused this order, and so dioceses of the church in Sicily and Calabria in southern Italy were seized by the Byzantines and transferred from the See of Rome to that of Constantinople. So by this time, clearly Rome is politically weak and vulnerable. The basic authority and dignity of the papacy is under threat from the Byzantines. And just a few years later, even the very existence of the papacy came under threat from the sudden invasion of Italy by a new Germanic group from the north, that is, the Lombards. And at this point, the papacy's old role as protector and guarantor of the security of Rome came back into play. So in 729, the Lombards invaded Italy and quickly besieged Rome. Gregory II, much like Leo I in the 400s, Gregory II went out and confronted the Lombard leader Liutprand and somehow persuaded him to lift the siege, and instead Liutprand donated his arms to the Basilica of St. Peter. But in 739, 10 years later, the Lombards besieged the city again, and this time they attacked and sacked the city. So, following this, Pope Gregory III turned for allies and supporters to the new rising power in Western Europe, which was the Franks. So the Frankish Empire at this time was mainly led really by the palace mayor called Charles Martel, who had famously beaten the Moors at the Battle of Poitiers in 732. So he had, both governing and military prowess. But there was something that Charles Martel lacked, which was an actual royal title. He was technically still just the mayor of the palace, while the sort of ineffectual kings on the throne were the Merovingian dynasty. So this allowed for a bargain to be struck, where basically the Pope agreed to crown Charles Martel's son Pepin as king of the Franks, to transfer formally that royal title onto Charles's family and dynasty, and in return, Charles and the Frankish state would help support and protect the papacy against the Lombards. So this was the basic exchange, and it began an alliance between the papacy and the French crown, which has lasted for over 1,000 years. So Pepin went with the Frankish armies into Italy and successfully defeated the Lombards and basically annexed their kingdom, except he gave a big chunk of north-central Italy to the Pope. And this piece of territory around Rome and just to the north, he handed it over to the Pope, and this is the real foundation of what we call the Papal States. Now, in later centuries, popes would claim that it went back further than that. There was the so-called donation of Constantine, where supposedly Constantine gave civil control over Rome to the Pope back in the 300s. That's a forgery, and, that was formally exposed years later. That was a fake, that was a forgery. The real origin of the Papal States here was in this bargain between the Carolingian dynasty of the Franks and the papacy in the 700s. And this was really formally sealed most of all in the year 800, when the next Frankish king, Charlemagne, was visiting Rome, and on Christmas Day in 800, he went in to worship at the Basilica in Rome, and Pope Leo crowned him, put a crown on his head, and proclaimed him as emperor in the West. And this is the beginning of the so-called Carolingian Empire, which later, is reincarnated as the Holy Roman Empire. So with this new political stability established by this alliance between the papacy and the Franks, the papacy was able to reassert itself again in the world of doctrine. So the popes began mediating conflicts and disputes between the Frankish-dominated West and the Byzantine East. For instance, this recurring iconoclastic controversy, where the Byzantine East keeps condemning the appearance and use of images in church worship. So the papacy engages in this debate and basically defends the Western position, which is pro-image, claiming that as long as you're not worshiping the image, it can actually help in inspiring piety and prayer. Now, it happens that Charlemagne himself was actually personally rather sympathetic to the East and also opposed icons, and this led to a brief feud and break between the Pope and the Emperor, but this was soon resolved. And more or less the Pope prevailed, and with Frankish backing, the popes were able to hold their own in this controversy against the East. Then in the 800s, there also was a controversy over the so-called filioque. So that's a phrase that some Western churches, as a matter of custom, began to insert into the Nicene Creed, that basic statement of faith. And I won't get into the details of that. It has to do with the sort of structure of the Trinity. We don't have to get into it. But this dispute over whether or not this phrase should appear in the Creed first flares up in Jerusalem in a sort of fight between Eastern and Western monks in Jerusalem. The Emperor Charlemagne took the Western side in this dispute. The Pope then intervened and mediated, and he basically affirmed the original creed, which led again to another rupture between the Pope and the Emperor, but it was eventually worked out, and in the later 800s, Pope Nicholas I finally formally added this filioque phrase into the creed. So you can see here ultimately a clear block is emerging, where you have imperial and papal authority aligned together in the West and taking clear positions against the patriarchs and the emperors in the East. Also shortly after, in the 800s, between 858 and 867, Pope Nicholas emerged as the most aggressive pope in consolidating the position of the papacy. So he most clearly asserted the supremacy of the popes over secular rulers, including even the Western emperors. He asserted the ultimate supremacy of the pope over all other prelates and their status as the single representative of God on earth. He intervened and deposed bishops who he saw as behaving poorly, breaking canon law and discipline, and he also pronounced judgments over Eastern patriarchs. He also asserted the supremacy of the papacy over councils, and all of this was actually precipitated initially by a fight over marriage. So in the year 858, the king Lothair of Lotharingia in northern Europe tried to annul his marriage, and the pope intervened to block this. So this was a new development, right, with the pope getting down and actually judging the legitimacy of marriages, right? Instead of that just being left up to the local priest or chaplain or kings just doing whatever they wanted, the pope is sort of asserting himself as the ultimate moral authority over everyone in the Western Church. Now, in response, in 862, Lothair convened a synod of Frankish bishops who approved the annulment of his marriage, right? They were his subjects, and they went along with what he wanted. But in 863, the Pope Nicholas declared this whole council illegitimate and proclaimed that only the Pope could call councils and only the Pope could annul a marriage. So Nicholas was really an amazing and, daring figure in building up this sort of unlimited authority of the Pope. But he was really a very rare exception for this time, right? So he reigned 858 to 867, but by and large, there was a general period of chaos from about the 840s through the 960s because the Frankish peace didn't last. And peace and stability were soon lost, and hence the authority of the papacy started to really break down. So in the early 800s, Arabs invaded Sicily in the Mediterranean, and then from there they went on to invade southern mainland Italy and set up a fairly long-lasting Islamic emirate based in southern Italy. Then shortly after, in the 840s, the Frankish Empire split up and then collapsed, and Rome was now left vulnerable to any sort of invader or attacker, including these Arab forces from the south. In 846, a large Arab fleet sailed right up the Tiber and sacked Rome, the first time this had happened in more than 100 years. In 849, the Pope Leo IV summoned navies of surrounding Italian states, took command of a combined fleet, and defeated the Arabs at sea. And then in 852, partly using labor from these captured Arab ships, the Pope commanded the building of an enormous defensive wall called the Leonine Wall, enclosing the Vatican and part of Rome down to the tomb of Hadrian on the Tiber River, which then became known as the Castel Sant'Angelo. And you may see it's still there in Rome today, and basically is, right at the end of that avenue coming down from St. Peter's. So this, you could say, was the beginning of what we think of as the Vatican City, a sort of fortified enclave and the seat of the capital of the church within Rome. But still, nonetheless, this was followed by a long chaotic period of over 100 years. So after the Frankish Empire split and Central Europe fell into chaos, the papacy was really exposed, and the papal throne became the object of feuding among Roman aristocratic clans and factions, which could actually muster sort of irregular gangs to seize control of and defend the city. So in this period of time were the first instances of popes being assassinated. Others were deposed and disappeared or packed off to monasteries. Many of them were accused of trumped-up crimes and tried before kangaroo courts. At one point, the Vatican cycled through a total of 6 popes in only 7 years. Some of them lasted only a few months on the throne. And many clans were able to maneuver to place their young sons basically as puppets on the papal throne. And some of these were immature men who showed low morals and basically turned the Vatican into pleasure palaces of sex and gambling. And also a story later arose in later years of a so-called Pope Joan, who supposedly was a female pope who reigned for 2.5 years at some point in this period in the 800s. And it seems that the stories arose originally around an odd sculpture showing a sort of female figure, a mother figure dressed in Pope's robes, which was erected for some reason in a particular lane, a street in the middle of Rome. We don't know why, we don't know where that sculpture came from, why it was there, what exactly it represents, but it seems that this gave rise over the time to this story of a Pope Joan who supposedly, concealed her sex, rose through the ranks, became pope, and then became pregnant. And while she was on procession from St. Peter's down to St. John in Lateran, right, on one of these journeys shuttling between those two basilicas, she was going down this street and went into labor and delivered a child, and that's when her sex was discovered, and she was deposed and killed. And it's very unlikely that this story is true. There's really no date or interval in time when she could have been pope. There's no reference to her from the 9th century. The story emerged later. But it seems as if this story somehow was symbolic. It came to represent this age of corruption and perversion in the church, when everything that could go wrong with the papacy did. And it's reminiscent of actual contemporary stories from the time of popes flaunting every sort of sin and luxury. And the 900s came to be called by scholars the pornocracy, the sort of rule by debauched harlots. It did actually include among them a young pope called John XII in the 950s, who basically used the Basilica of St. Peter as a harem. Now, eventually, this long reign of chaos and debauchery was interrupted by outside intervention, and in time, this led to a gradual revival and reform of the papacy. So this started in the 960s when King Otto of Saxony successfully united most of the German lands in Northern Europe and then was crowned as Holy Roman Emperor, in this way reviving and reclaiming the authority of Charlemagne. And after basically creating this Holy Roman Empire, he then brought his gathered troops into Rome, occupied the city, held a synod, right, a council of churchmen and lay people, which charged Pope John XII, this very, debauched pope, of all sorts of crimes, and deposed him. But John then later came back. He still had some support among the Roman ruling classes. He had a sort of patronage network. He was basically their puppet. So they try to put him back on the papal throne. And this leads then to a decades-long power struggle with feuding and violence between, on the one hand, reformists who support the Holy Roman Emperor, who are often German and French, and who try to basically clean up the Vatican and the papacy, and on the other hand, stalwarts, who were usually Italians and who were chosen by the Roman clans and the curia, the sort of papal bureaucracy in the Vatican, which is mainly staffed with Italians. So the empire kept repeatedly intervening and installing one of their preferred clerics as pope when they and their armies are in Rome. And this included among them the first ever French pope, Sylvester II, who was appointed in 998 and was fairly well liked. But there were many others who had no actual support in Rome. And so when the imperial armies withdrew and left the city, these popes would then be overthrown and replaced by a Roman. And this often led also to temporary schisms, splits between different factions in the church over who was the legitimate pope, right? Someone might install one pope, and then a week later, someone holds a council, elects a different pope, and you get a feud, you get a schism. So there were repeated small schisms where people would support one pope they considered to be legitimate, and they would label the other illegitimate pontiff as an anti-pope. Right? So you get these popes and anti-popes. And these small schisms led eventually into a much bigger schism. So after 1000, the reformists, backed by the Holy Roman Emperor, eventually gained the upper hand in this power struggle. And local Roman contenders turned for support then to the Byzantines, right? The great Eastern rivals of the Holy Roman Emperor. So after 1000, control over the papal throne in Rome really became a proxy for a greater power struggle between East and West, and between the Byzantines and the Germans. So the papacy now seemed more and more like really a death trap, or at least a white elephant, that, if you were crowned as pope, you were bound to be overthrown, killed, disappeared. And after Sylvester II, men of character and intelligence basically stayed away, and the throne was taken up instead by mediocre men who acted as pawns of greater political powers. The curia was filled with uninspiring and mediocre Roman bureaucrats. But a turning point eventually came in 1048, when the throne was vacant and the Holy Roman Emperor simply couldn't find anyone that he could convince to take it. And so instead, a council was held in Germany, and this council drafted a recruit, basically strong-arming him into accepting the throne. And that was the emperor's second cousin, the Bishop of Toul in northeastern France. And he reluctantly accepted this election on the condition that the people of Rome also approve him, so he wouldn't be, the object of a tug of war between these contending forces. And they did. He was acclaimed when he went into Rome, and he took up the papal throne then as Leo IX. And Leo IX became really a great pivotal figure of the age, really of the entire medieval age. And he launched the church, and even, you could say, all of Western society into the High Middle Ages. So Leo IX was an avid reformer and an internationalist. He barnstormed across Europe, preaching to crowds, inveighing against corruption and politicking in the church. He promoted the idea of celibacy for the clergy, and he believed that this would make the clergy more free from sin and from entanglement in worldly affairs of politics, wealth, property. He brought in very talented men from all over Europe into the Vatican and made the Curia really international. And he summoned bishops to synods in the different regions of Europe, and he summarily fired any who had paid to get their offices. He considered this simony, the sin of paying for church power or church services. So Leo IX was on the throne for only 5 years before he died. It was not a long pontificate, but it had enormous resounding consequences. So among these major consequences, for one, was conflict with the Greek East, which led to the ultimate split between East and West. So the West was diverging at this time more and more from the East in terms of doctrine and practice. There was, as we said, the wide use of the filioque phrase in the Creed, which the Eastern Church did not accept as legitimate. There was the strict use of only unleavened bread in the Eucharist, whereas the East used leavened bread. I don't know the exact significance of that, but, something to fight about. And there also was this growing custom of the celibate priesthood, which became more and more the standard in the West in the 11th century and was strange and alien to the East. So as this divide was growing, the Eastern Orthodox Church also became more and more resentful of the very assertive and confident papacy of Leo IX. And fights actually broke out in southern Italy between supporters of the Pope and those of the Eastern Church. Fights over what sort of bread to use, how to say the Creed, and who was the ultimate leader of the Church, the Pope or the Patriarch. And in the spring of 1054, as this fight was intensifying in Italy, in the spring of 1054, the Eastern Patriarch condemned certain controversial Western practices as sinful and Judaistic. He ordered the Latin churches in Constantinople to change over to the Eastern Greek rite and Greek customs, and he shut down the churches that refused. So in response, Pope Leo in Rome sent delegates to the East, and they went to Constantinople and were received by the emperor, but the Patriarch sort of held them off at arm's length and didn't hold a formal reception for them. While they were there, while these Western delegates were in Constantinople, Pope Leo in Rome died, and hence the Eastern Church refused to recognize these delegates as legitimate representatives of the papacy at all, and the Patriarch completely ignored them. But these delegates didn't go home. They stayed in Constantinople, and they engaged instead in a debate with a learned Greek monk. And this debate also devolved into an acrimonious fight. One Western delegate called him, quote, a pestiferous pimp and a disciple of malignant Mahomet. So they're now imputing supposed Muslim influence on the Eastern Church. On July 16th, 1054, during a mass held at the great Basilica of Santa Sofia, the 3 papal delegates barged in, walked up to the altar, and laid out a bull or proclamation pronouncing the Eastern Patriarch excommunicated. They then stormed out, and after they left, the Patriarch went back up to the lectern and in turn excommunicated them and burned their proclamation. So this ugly fight was seen at the time as basically just a further escalation of this growing split and feud between the Eastern and Western churches, but it was not necessarily seen as permanent. These excommunications were the product of the fight at the moment, and they were directed only at individuals, not at entire churches. So it was widely expected that eventually this would be worked out, as previous feuds had been. But it happens that it was not worked out. This feud was never patched up, and in fact it has lingered now for almost 1,000 years. And so in retrospect, this event is called the Great Schism, and is seen as the final institutional separation of the Eastern and Western churches, although some on both sides, even still today, hold out hope for the possibility of reconciliation and the restoration of communion between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. And that even has come more onto the agenda, you could say, in recent years, in the last half century. But regardless, at this time, as the Great Schism unfolded, a kind of religious iron curtain descended over Europe, which forced states and commonwealths on the borderlines, like Venice or Serbia or Bulgaria, to finally choose a side. And once this was completed, this now left the papacy as really the sole undisputed supreme authority in the Western Latin sphere. Now, the second great impact of Leo IX's reign was that it launched the so-called Reform Papacy. So followers and protégés of Leo became pope after him, and they carried on his campaign to cleanse the church of supposed corruptions and sin, and to make the church more fully independent of secular authorities. So the watchwords of the Reform Papacy were puritas and libertas, purity and freedom. And very important episodes in this Reform Papacy include, for one thing, the Investiture controversy. So that's the fight over who would appoint bishops and other important clergy within the Holy Roman Empire. So the context of this was that the church had, of course, spread far into Northern Europe, all the way up to Scandinavia by this time. And in those northern lands, it was very hard for Rome to maintain control. And the church on the ground was largely run by local clerics, including bishops and abbots, who were really more connected to local elites and power brokers and to their own families. They were often picked and appointed by local rulers or by the Holy Roman Emperor. And they often had wives or concubines, mistresses, etc., and they fathered children. And often they then would collect wealth and land and then pass it on to their own families, rather than leaving it as part of the property of the church, the patrimony of St. Peter. Now, in particular, the clergy and church lands in the Holy Roman Empire were basically under the control of the emperor and the local princes and potentates. The high-level clergy were invested with a ring and crozier, a sort of shepherd's crook, as symbols of church authority by the emperor. And also some church offices were for sale. And again, this instance of what was called simony. Whoever could pay the Holy Roman Emperor enough could get appointed to an important bishopric. Now, in the 1070s, in the midst of this, Pope Gregory got into an intense fight with the Emperor Henry on the grounds that the emperor was associating with counselors who had already been excommunicated. Right? And if someone's been excommunicated by the Pope, they're supposed to be shunned. And this fight, which initially was trivial, then escalated until each one, the Pope and the Emperor, formally deposed the other one from his office. So it ends up becoming a showdown over who is the supreme authority between the power of the secular ruler, supposedly to remove churchmen, just as he appointed churchmen, versus the spiritual power of the Pope, who now claims the right to remove rulers from their thrones. In 1075, the Pope issued a declaration saying that he was the only universal and supreme authority in Christendom, with the sole power to appoint and remove bishops and to depose usurping rulers, even an emperor. So this was a clear threat to the emperor. And the empire struck back. Henry refuted the Pope's claims in a formal letter, which was headed with the address, quote, Henry, king not through usurpation, but through the holy ordination of God, to Hildebrand, at present not pope, but false monk. So, the emperor here is, again, he's sort of asserting a divine right. Long before that was a widely accepted doctrine. He's saying he is ruler through ordination by God, and he's addressing the Pope by his old name, Hildebrand, not even recognizing him as being Pope. And this letter then demanded the election of a new pope. And through this feud in 1076, the emperor also started appointing bishops within Italy and even in Milan, which had always traditionally been the province of the Pope. So the Pope then excommunicated Henry and released all Christians from duty of allegiance to him. So basically calling for anarchy in the Holy Roman Empire. And in the following several years, local princes and lords in the Holy Roman Empire took advantage of this and started seizing royal lands and serfs and fortifying their domains, which was forbidden. Many Italian cities also rallied around the Pope, seeing him now as a champion of home rule and autonomy for these Italian cities within the Holy Roman Empire. So it seems very soon that there might be an all-out war between supporters of the emperor on the one side and nobles and communes aligned with the Pope on the other side. But this feud was temporarily resolved by the incident at Canossa in 1077. So at this point, the emperor knows that the Pope is not really free to act like a fully independent sovereign. Rather, his authority depends on following religious rules and strictures. That's the whole basis of the Pope's office. And so he knows that if he repents of his sins before the Pope will then have no choice but to give him absolution and lift the excommunication. That's how excommunication is supposed to work. It is not permanent. It's only until you repent, receive absolution, and do penance. So the Pope knows that he's, winning this conflict with the emperor because the emperor is excommunicated. So he doesn't want to have to lift the excommunication. And it becomes a sort of game of cat and mouse. So when the Pope Gregory begins traveling through the Apennine Mountains to go to Augsburg in Austria, the Emperor Henry tracks him down and is able to corner him at his castle at Canossa. Now, Gregory doesn't let him in. He keeps the gates locked, and so Henry now has to kneel in the snow for 3 days outside the castle gates until Gregory finally relents and is forced to go out and meet with the emperor and give him absolution. So the excommunication is lifted, and now the power struggle resumes and is carried on for years by later emperors and popes, with many more schisms and anti-popes being appointed. And it's only finally resolved in the 1120s with an agreement between the Pope and the Emperor at Worms. And under this agreement, the local church councils will now elect bishops within the Holy Roman Empire. So it's not directly in the church's hands nor in the emperor's either. This is their compromise. But the emperor can be present at these councils that choose bishops, and he can intervene in disputed elections. So this Concordat of Worms is then ratified by a series of councils convoked by the Pope at his Roman basilica in the Lateran Hill in Rome. So this is the First and Second Lateran Council, and these two councils conclude that church lands and money belong to the church as a body, not to individual clergymen. All clergy must be celibate. They cannot have wives or concubines. Only unmarried men can be ordained, and any marriages contracted by clergymen must be dissolved. And their reasoning in this is that this will make the clergy less prone to sin. So the Second Lateran Council in 1139, in its reports, it includes the decree, quote, "For since they should be and be called the temple of God, the vessel of the Lord, the abode of the Holy Spirit, it is unbecoming that they indulge in marriage and in impurities." So there is this sort of stated spiritual motive, which can sound weird to us, right? We think of marriage as holy and fully moral, but from the point of view of this council, it's a sort of indulgence. But the real material, the underlying material motive, is that this makes it easier to keep property in the hands of the church, right? The clergy should not have their own heirs or dynasties, which will compete with the church for their loyalties or demand church lands as inheritances. So these pronouncements from the First and Second Lateran Councils ultimately help to define the clergy as a special class or estate apart from ordinary society, and subject ultimately only to the authority of the Pope, not the secular state. Now, the last big reverberating result of the Reformed Papacy is actually the Crusades, which is a whole movement and phenomenon that I've discussed before. I posted several lectures about the Crusades in my first series about the Middle Ages. But as you might know, the First Crusade was called by Pope Urban II in November 1095. And Urban II was a Frenchman. He was a follower of this reform movement started by Leo, and his main base of support was in France. And at the time when he came to the throne, there was a rival claimant, a so-called anti-pope, who was actually in control of Rome. So that was the anti-pope Clement III, and that was the result of a lingering schism that went back to the Investiture controversy. But Urban II is recognized by most of the Western world as the real legitimate pope, and mainly in France, right? And he was also shrewd, and he wanted to consolidate power in his own hands as sole legitimate pope and to sideline this anti-pope in Rome. But he had no military power to overcome the rival party, in Rome, which was backed up by the Holy Roman Empire. So instead, Urban decided that he could sideline this anti-pope by rallying rulers and nobles all over Christendom together under his one banner in furtherance of some shared sacred cause. And so he called a council in France at Clermont and declared a crusade to retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. And the anti-pope Clement then died a few years later in 1100, and the pro-imperial party basically collapsed and the schism was over. So the First Crusade served to bolster papal prestige, both political and spiritual. So politically, it put the papacy forward as the main leader for kings and lords to rally around, and the pope would actually set the political and military agenda. And spiritually also, the pope declared a so-called plenary indulgence for those who went on crusade, meaning that those who embarked on this armed pilgrimage could then substitute this as an act of penance for any and all other acts of penance that the person might own for their sins. So in this way, this sort of spiritual power of the Pope directly supersedes any other clergy anywhere in the world who might be administering confession and penance or assigning penances. So this was a further extension of known accepted practices in the church, but it seemed again to dramatize the Pope's special power as the holder of the keys of heaven. So by this time, really now the Latin Church and the papacy were mutually constitutive. To be a Latin Christian meant to recognize the See of Rome as the center of the church and the Pope as its supreme leader, both politically and spiritually. And that spiritual authority was then further reinforced through the 1100s and into the 1200s. In 1184, the Papal Inquisition was founded. So that was a permanent law court set up to investigate and suppress heretical movements like the Cathars and the Waldensians. But most importantly, in 1215, the Pope Innocent III convoked the Fourth Lateran Council in Rome. And this council codified the so-called seven sacraments. So sacrament previously had been a very broad, informal term, just meaning a holy act. So it could be any number of things like a baptism or a funeral or going on a pilgrimage or giving to a charity. But the Fourth Lateran Council specifically codified that there were seven actual real sacraments, and these were baptism, confirmation, confession and penance, the Eucharist, marriage, ordination, and last rites. And several of these were really significant, like for one, marriage. That hadn't always been done in the church. Often marriages were just contracted at home, and then you'd let people know, hey, we're married. That was then brought in fully into the purview of the church as a sacrament. And this is one of the ways that this codification of the sacraments really reached deep into basic everyday practices of the church as experienced by lay people in everyday life. And this codification and most of the pronouncements of the Fourth Lateran Council were really proposed by the Pope Innocent, and the council just served as a rubber stamp. And this shows, again, the tremendous prestige of the papacy as the driving force in the church in this time, but also still this note of ambiguity. There was still ambiguity about the actual location of ultimate authority in the church. The papacy was clearly central, but there was still this lingering sense in the background that major decisions about fundamentals of the faith had to be ratified by a council. And this viewpoint still persisted, called conciliarism, which held that the real ultimate authority in the church really was the council, which came into play then later when the papacy was challenged and again began to lose its authority and its primacy. So in sum, the High Middle Ages, especially the 1100s and early 1200s, represent a high watermark of papal power and prestige. But this period did not last long. The heyday was brief. One problem was repeated, continuing schisms. There was no clear, definite rule for electing new popes. It was usually just somebody was picked by some meeting of cardinals convened here or there. And there could again be splits if more than one gathering was held and different groups made different choices. So this also continued to hamper the effectiveness of the papacy. And then in later years, especially after 1200, the crusading movement was commandeered, and crusades now were launched and led more by strong monarchs like Richard the Lionheart of England, Louis IX of France, Andrew II of Hungary, etc. So by the 1200s, papal power was definitely slipping relative to the monarchical states, which were centralizing and asserting themselves more. And more the popes butted heads with powerful royal houses, including the Capets in France, the Angevins in England, the Habsburgs in Central Europe, and the Hohenstaufens, especially the Emperor Frederick II, who really thumbed his nose at the church and the papacy and was repeatedly excommunicated and just didn't care, went on with his agenda and his activities anyway. And this increasing struggle between the papacy and these powerful dynasties, especially the Hohenstaufens in Germany, this drove the popes more and more into the arms of their traditional defender, which was France. So in the 1200s, many popes themselves were French, since the French had so much leverage over the choice of cardinals, who made up the College of Cardinals. And the Vatican more and more was run by this College of Cardinals, which was dominated mainly by powerful Italian families and by the French. But this alliance was very uneasy, especially there was friction between the Italians and the French in the Vatican. There was a widening divide over questions of exactly how much power secular rulers should have over the church within their own realms and domains. And the main factions included, on the one hand, the Ultramontanists, who were mostly Italian and who held that the Pope should control, even at the parish level, the entire church throughout Christendom. And on the other hand, their opponents, mainly Gallicans from French, who believed that the crown should have some control over an autonomous French national church. So with this new feud, papal elections were then often very contentious and acrimonious. They were interfered with by political actors, and they often took a very long time, leaving long intervals without any pope. And most dramatically, in 1268, the cardinals met in the town of Viterbo in Italy, just north of Rome, in order to elect a new pope. But the political factions began feuding, and envoys from different states kept arriving in Viterbo and interfering in the election with bribes and threats. So the council dragged on for 3 years. 137 ballots were taken. 3 of the electors died over the course of the process. And finally, the city government of Viterbo became sick of this, and so city officials locked the cardinals into their meeting hall in isolation, limited their rations to only bread and water, and then finally removed the roof of the hall in order to force them to come to a conclusion. And thereafter, the church codified these new rules of isolation in order to protect the process of election from interference. And a few years later, in 1276, the first papal election was held by conclave, right? A closed gathering, secret proceedings. And conclave simply means with the key or under lock and key. But still, struggles continued between the different factions in the church. Some cardinals in Rome also became flagrantly corrupt and nepotistic in granting church offices to friends and family members, and they lived increasingly extravagant lifestyles. Political feuding was intense, and Rome became generally unsafe, run by clashing oligarchic families. So some popes simply stayed out of Rome and tried to govern as best they could from Naples or other smaller cities around Italy. And the papacy gradually lost power and prestige. Cardinals did start to try to reform and clean up their act in the 1290s. And in 1294, they elected a simple, pious Benedictine monk who took the throne as Pope Celestine V. But Celestine was totally overwhelmed, could not handle the politics and feuding, and he resigned after only 5 months. And it happens that this was the last resignation from the papal throne by an undisputed pope until Benedict XVI in 2013. And the next pope who followed after Celestine, Boniface VIII, lasted a bit longer, but his reign was equally chaotic and even disastrous. He got into a political feud with King Philip the Fair of France over who had the power to tax the clergy and to punish clergy who committed crimes, right? Traditional bones of contention. But in 1301, Boniface declared papal supremacy over all matters and said, quote, "God has placed us over the kings and kingdoms." So Philip was infuriated. In 1303, he sent a gang of hired goons into Italy to break into the Pope's house in the town of Anagni and take him prisoner. But the Pope was narrowly saved by a mob of townsfolk who fought this mercenary squad and liberated the Pope. Now, after this incident, the situation was clearly untenable, and the conflict came to a head after Boniface died. So in 1305, the Pope died and a conclave was held, but it was completely deadlocked. And under extreme pressure and threats from the French, they did finally elect Clement V, who was a Frenchman. And he was basically then controlled as a puppet by King Philip of France. And for instance, he complied with Philip's demand to dissolve the Templar order. In 1309, he then moved the papal court indefinitely out of Rome and set it up in the city of Avignon, which was a papal fiefdom within the south of France. So this began the so-called Avignon Papacy. So the papacy remained in Avignon for 67 years until 1376. A total of 7 popes resided at Avignon. All of them were French, and they were basically more or less puppets of the French crown. And the Avignon popes also lived in a state of increasing opulence, and the curia and papal bureaucracy expanded to manage more land and money all through southern France. But this led to a great disillusionment with the papacy, which now was seen as weak and corrupted, and it lost its aura of sanctity, especially being away from the traditional holy city of Rome. And the institution more and more was attacked by a coalition of critics, including the Franciscan order and church philosophers like William of Ockham in England and Marsilius of Padua, who was Italian but was based at the University of Paris. And Marsilius wrote a scathing book titled The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which argued that the papacy should be stripped of its temporal powers, so powers over territory, money, and property, basically its worldly powers, and the church should be put in a subordinated role to the state, made basically into a government department, and matters of faith and doctrine even should be decided by ecumenical councils, not the Pope. And these ideas were seen as radical at first, but they gained greater and greater traction through the later 1300s and into the 1400s. And there were also more immediate practical problems for the Avignon papacy. One was their ability to maintain control of the papal states in Italy. So they're away in France, and it's hard for them to then maintain this base of power in Italy. And the papal states were a big food producer. They produced a lot of grain. And when food became scarce in Italy in famines, which were increasingly frequent in the 1300s, the other Italian cities wanted to get access to those food resources from the papal states. In particular, in 1374, when there was a severe famine, the papacy placed an embargo prohibiting any exports of food out of the papal states. And in response, a league of northern Italian cities joined together and declared war on the papacy. So now there's this extreme pressure for the popes to either return to Rome or potentially lose all their territories in Italy to this anti-papal league. And also at the same time, the lay preacher, St. Catherine of Siena, became widely renowned as a visionary and preacher in Italy, and she preached that the popes must return to the holy city of Rome or else lose their sacred religious authority. So finally, under extreme pressure in 1377, the Pope Gregory XI moved the papal court back to Rome and the Vatican. The following year, Gregory died, and the College of Cardinals was split because 16 cardinals now were back in Rome, but 6 had remained in Avignon. So the cardinals are divided between these two cities, and each group held their own little conclave and elected their own pope. And so you have another schism, and it seems as if the Roman group would prevail as being more legitimate. But the problem was that the conclave there in Rome had been pressured by armed gangs of the powerful Roman families. So this time they seemed to be tainted by interference, and so their election was of questionable legitimacy. So the church then split into two parties supporting the two rival popes. And schisms like this had happened before, but this one lasted longer, for 39 years, and it forced people and institutions all across Europe to take sides. And in time, it almost destroyed the papacy. So in 1409, as this schism is dragging on, a council was convened at the city of Pisa in Italy to try to resolve the feud. And what they did is they rejected both of the existing claimants and instead elected another compromise pope. But neither of the existing popes accepted this or stepped down. And so this then only made the problem worse. Now you have 3 rival popes. And this triple schism was only finally resolved in 1417, when a church council was held at Constance in Germany. And this one first declared the ultimate supremacy of councils over popes. So the papacy is now in such a shambles that this council is basically usurping them as the ultimate supreme authority in the church. Secondly, they declared that general councils should be held regularly. This should be a recurring practice. And thirdly, it deposed all 3 of the existing popes and elected another new pope who took the throne as Martin V. So this one finally stuck. Basically, throughout Western Christendom, people accepted Martin is the new pope, and these councils are now the real supreme governing body. So through the rest of the 1400s, basically, conciliarism held sway, and it was widely agreed that the final, ultimate, and supreme authority in the church was a council. New councils were convened in 1423 at Pavia and in 1431 at Basel in Switzerland. And this council met then on and off for the next 14 years. And a significant action it took was it set out an oath that popes would have to take when taking up the throne. And in this way, they're sort of declaring their right to set the parameters of the Pope's authority. In 1438, though, the council mostly decamped out of Basel and moved to Italy. And they went to Italy in order to meet with delegates that had come from the Byzantine Empire. And there was hope of possibly working out a deal to reunify the Eastern and Western churches. And this council would be the body to seal this deal. Now, some of the bishops who were in Basel rejected this and instead remained in Basel, and they then schismed and elected another anti-pope, so there was another short-lived schism. But meanwhile, in Italy, that's where most of the council met, first in Ferrara and then in Florence. And under the leadership and facilitation of Pope Eugene, they did successfully work out a deal to bring the 2 churches, East and West, back into communion under the leadership of the Pope as overall suzerain. So this accord then was a dramatic reversal. And you may remember I talked about this in my lecture on Venice, since Venice was involved in all of this. But basically, the Byzantines agreed to this because their backs were against the wall. They were about to be finally besieged and overthrown by the Ottoman Turks, and they would do anything for Western support. So that's why this came about. But nonetheless, this agreement was a dramatic political coup for the papacy, and it allowed then for the beginning of a recovery of authority and prestige for the papacy. And the papacy now was again reunified, the schism was over, they were again based back in Rome, the traditional center of the Western Church. And although the papacy was still very much diminished in terms of political power as compared to where they had been back in the High Middle Ages, nonetheless, they were able to start rebuilding something of their position of moral and religious authority. And after 1450, the papacy began to recover some dignity, in part by association with the Renaissance. So popes largely pared back the extravagance of the papal court. They instituted stricter discipline and austerity. They adopted the sort of understated humanist taste of the Florentine Renaissance. And important Renaissance popes like Nicholas V and Innocent VII became patrons of humanism and classical scholarship, and they tended to stay out of power politics, right, to sort of keep their own hands clean. But then in the later 1400s, certain powerful families, mainly the Della Roveres and the Borgias, started feuding again over control of the papal throne. And this had very mixed results and implications. So in 1492, the powerful Borgia family was able to get one of their own, Rodrigo Borgia, elected as pope, and he took the throne as Alexander VI. And one thing that Alexander did was he brought back the extravagance and debauchery back into the Vatican, and he fathered countless illegitimate children, both before and during his papacy. But then after 1500, the Vatican started to use a lot of this money and power to seriously patronize Renaissance art. And they brought in new inventive artists like Raffaello from Urbino in the Papal States. In 1509, Raffaello painted the School of Athens, this really splendorous, stunning fresco painting depicting the sages of ancient Athens and celebrating antiquity and classical wisdom. And this was painted right in an office in the papal apartments. And thanks to papal patronage, Rome soon really rose to eclipse Florence and to become the main great center of the High Renaissance, basically from 1500 to 1530. And the Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel, which he did beginning first on the vault with scenes of Genesis. And these scenes can be seen as humanist, celebrating the potential, the beauty, the creativity of humankind, that famous central scene of Adam and God reaching out to one another, showing, you could say, the closeness of God to his creation in humanity. And at the same time in the 1510s, the popes began raising money to build a grand new Renaissance-style basilica of St. Peter's on the Vatican to replace the smaller old basilica that dated from the time of Constantine. So in this way, in Rome, the Renaissance really had two very different faces, one which was austere, in line with the civic humanist spirit of Florence, and the other extravagant and self-aggrandizing. And these two different sides coexisted and eventually came into serious and disastrous conflict. So the Vatican was certainly aware of growing movements for reform within the Western Church that had emerged through the 14th and 15th centuries, including heretical movements like the Waldensians and the Hussites, and also lay movements like the Brethren of the Common Life in Northern Europe that had remained within the Catholic fold. But all of these movements for reform rejected the special powers and wealth of the clergy. They rejected elaborate church ceremony in favor of simple internal piety based in personal faith and in the scriptures. And this was in line with the rising literacy in Europe and also the spirit of the Renaissance. And the papacy tried in some way to negotiate, you could say, with this growing demand for reform. And they recognized this broad desire for change and sought in some way to accommodate and incorporate it. So in 1512, the Pope called the Fifth Lateran Council, which then met in Rome for 5 years, and discussed various ideas for reform and made a series of proposals, mainly for stricter discipline and austerity in the Church. During this council in 1513, a new pope was elected who took the throne as Leo X, and he was from the Medici family. And he, for his part, fully embraced the Renaissance. He enlarged the Roman University and rededicated it to classics and humanism. He spent lavishly on Renaissance art, which then got the Vatican deeply into debt. He embraced the ideas of the Fifth Lateran Council, but he failed to really effectively implement them or to implement fiscal reforms and lifestyle rules for the clergy. And he also tried to call a crusade against the Ottomans, which really went nowhere. And he continued this project to expand and rebuild St. Peter's. And in order to raise desperately needed funds to pay for this St. Peter's project and to get the Vatican out of debt, he deputized preachers, especially from the Dominican order, to travel through Christendom selling indulgences, right? So basically offering, if you donate to this project, then that will release you from your duty to perform any other acts of penance. So this campaign of indulgence selling in the 1510s then triggered a dispute when a German Augustinian canon named Martin Luther reacted against this practice and posted 95 theses criticizing and condemning the sale of indulgences. And this might have just been a minor local theological controversy, except that it ended up escalating. Firstly, Dominican preachers who were carrying out this sale of indulgences disputed Luther's theses, but Luther stood his ground, And the Dominicans then passed information about this debate all the way up to the Pope himself, right? This indulgence selling campaign had been spearheaded by the Pope. So Pope Leo finds out about this, and he ends up condemning Luther's ideas as heretical. Luther then escalates in kind and writes pamphlets eventually declaring that the church is under another Babylonian captivity. Right? So he's invoking the same idea of Marsilius of Padua, who had condemned the Avignon papacy. He argues the church is under another Babylonian captivity, that the Pope was an antichrist, which does not just mean, Satan or an evil figure. It specifically means a false Christ, a person who offers a false path to salvation in place of real salvation. And from this point onward, the papacy really becomes the great villain in this new emerging Protestant worldview, right? The church is under the control of this evil force that falsely claims to offer salvation through these wicked practices like indulgences, where, in their view, real salvation only comes through faith or with faith. So the Protestant Reformation then spread quickly, and the next two popes through the 1520s and 30s mostly dithered and were afraid of taking any aggressive action, since, for one thing, Rome itself was insecure. They were at the mercy of rising northern powers. The city was sacked by the Holy Roman Empire in 1527. And they also were afraid of calling together an ecumenical council to mediate and deal with this crisis, since they were afraid it might undermine their papal authority. There were still a lot of conciliarists around. And if you gather together a bunch of conciliarist bishops into a big council, they might just depose the Pope. So finally, it was left to the next Pope, Paul III, who came to the throne in 1534, to somehow deal with this crisis. So first, he supported and recognized new religious orders that could be used then to reform and reorient the church from within. And most importantly, in 1540, he recognized the Society of Jesus, or the so-called Jesuits, which had been organized by former soldiers and saw itself as a kind of spiritual crusading order. In 1542, he set up a permanent office of the Inquisition in Italy under direct papal control, which came to be called the Roman Inquisition, and it mainly targeted Protestantism and other heresies in Italy. It contained the spread of the Reformation and basically shored up Italy as a stronghold of Catholicism. Then finally, in 1545, when he believed the church and the papacy were ready, he called together a council, and it met at Trent in northern Italy, off and on, for 18 years. And Trent was centrally located, and it could attract leading lights of theology and of the church from all over these Catholic regions, these countries that had not embraced the Protestant Reformation. And the Council of Trent was critical in redefining Catholicism and really launching the so-called Catholic Reformation. So it decreed stronger discipline for the behavior of the clergy. It rejected Protestant iconoclasm. It reaffirmed the validity of art as a part of worship, and the beatification of the Church and the Vatican continued. It rejected the idea of sola scriptura, the idea that only Scripture alone could define doctrine, and instead affirmed that tradition was also a valid source of authority alongside Scripture. And this was especially important in maintaining the role of the papacy as an interpreter of Scripture and doctrine. Trent declared that the Pope was the monarch of the Church. And this was the beginning, really, of the early modern age, which lasted from the 1500s through the 1700s. And as I've said before, this was the monarchical era par excellence, and the Church really tried to follow this model of creating a centralized monarchical structure. And more broadly, Trent launched the Catholic Reformation, the process of standardizing Catholic Church practices, including, for one thing, the liturgy of the Latin Mass. And hence, the traditional Latin Mass that you might hear today is also called Tridentine, because it was defined at Trent in 1570. And also, it sponsored the proliferation of new groups, orders, and institutions that the Church could embrace as a means of cultivating popular piety and channeling it into orthodox channels. Right? That is how you kept people in the Catholic fold. And Trent was critical in shoring up the power of the Church and the papacy, which were now almost synonymous. as it was forced to compete against the rising power of secular monarchies, including in Portugal, Spain, and France. And the most important group, as we've mentioned before, in reorienting and centralizing the church under this new papal regime was the Jesuits. So the Jesuits emphasized inner spiritual engagement, as you can see, for instance, in the practice of general confessions, where one could go to a Jesuit priest and give a sort of complete narrative of one's life, and also the spiritual exercises, which were a system developed by Ignatius Loyola to sort of look for inner spiritual direction for one's life. And the Jesuits were given special powers, power to roam throughout the Christian world, missionize, preach, and teach anywhere they wanted, hear confessions, even general confessions, wherever they wanted, without the permission of the local clergy in the parish or diocese. And this enabled them to act as sort of shock troops for the Catholic Reformation and as roving agents, you could say, for the papacy. Right? The order owed its obedience directly to the Pope. Although no popes were Jesuits themselves, they were always linked directly to the Vatican. And this allowed them also to build up a great deal of political power. So the staffing of much of the church and royal bureaucracies was from the Jesuits, and they also even provided confessors to the main monarchs. Very often the king of France or of Austria would be confessing to a Jesuit who could then have tremendous influence in the political realm. And this naturally created a lot of friction and resentment, which would build through the years within the Catholic world over this enormous special role of the Jesuits and the way that they could compete in unprecedented ways with the traditional established church hierarchy. So this controversy over the Jesuits and what they represented would then continue through the rest of the history of the church, right up to recent times. And I expect that in a second part, I'll talk then about the modern papacy, from this time of the Catholic Reformation all the way up to recent popes, including among them, of course, Pope Francis, who was the first Jesuit pope. So all of this history and background I've been talking about is critical to then understanding the dramas and struggles around the papacy in recent years. And I hope that I'll be able to record a second lecture about that soon, and probably will post it on Patreon for patrons. So please sign up as a patron at any level, even if it's just $1, if you want to hear the patron-only lectures. And lastly, since we're coming up to the beginning of July, I would like to thank my current active patrons who originally signed up in whatever year in the month of July. So thank you to Ronja Bergerson, Sigo Duty, Tom Gammons, Seth Hamilton, Paula Ortega, Ali Evans, Julie Bell, Mona Enna, Mark Walker, Magnus Fredrickson, Patrick Gordon, William H., Kyle Kaspers, Scott Smith, Alan Engel, Yana, Sam Mess, Yulia Gilic, Nicole Morse, and Shamant Gila. Thank you.